Thanks for tuning in. I'm Scott Walter.
And I'm Michael Watson.
In this episode, we take a look at the far-left interest groups, political consultants, and personalities behind Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York City. This is the InfluenceWatch podcast. In November 2017, New York City voters cast their ballots for city offices, overwhelmingly returning Democratic incumbent Bill de Blasio to Gracie Mansion. De Blasio rose to power in 2013 on the back of a militantly left-wing agenda that would end 20 years of government by politically centrist law and order mayors Rudy Giuliani, a Republican, and Michael Bloomberg, a liberal, who is not aligned with either major party. Before you tune out because his honor is New York's problem, de Blasio has a national advocacy structure and took his re-election victory lap in Iowa. Engineering de Blasio's rise was the left-wing political consultancy Berlin Rosen and the far-left Working Families Party, as well as the labor union 1199 SEIU. That union represents healthcare workers in New York City. Once he reached the top, de Blasio's first term was a swirl of controversy as he went to great lengths to reward his friends. Despite a record of alleged corruption and controversy, the left-wing trend in liberal politics has de Blasio turning himself into a national figure. He set up an advocacy group, the Progressive Agenda Committee, to promote his left-wing approach nationwide. With another 4 years to make New York City the capital of resistance to the Trump administration and a laboratory for left-wing policies on crime, social issues, and economics, the forces that brought de Blasio to power may find themselves on the national stage. Mike, give us a little background on Mayor de Blasio.
So before he gets elected mayor in 2013, de Blasio's a sort of a journeyman politician in the New York City Democratic Party. He served as public advocate, which is a citywide elected office that doesn't have all that much real power or authority, but it's a platform that you can advocate for whatever it is that the public advocate wishes, which of course, being New York City, usually is left-wing stuff.
Yeah, he was actually the fourth choice of city Democrats for that first term, wasn't he?
Yeah, the 2013 Democratic mayoral primary in New York City was very involved and very divided. The favorite going in was said to be Christine Quinn, who was the Speaker of the City Council at the time. She was an ally of Bloomberg, more politically centrist, but still very socially liberal. There was Bill Thompson, who had run and lost to Bloomberg in 2009, former comptroller. He was the choice of the public employee unions, the United Federation of Teachers, the Teachers Union. And then there was Anthony Weiner, who people watching this have probably heard of. The Chekhov's gun of American politics, was trying to make his first comeback from his sexting habit.
Unfortunately, that did not happen, did it?
Former Representative Weiner was caught sexting again, so his campaign imploded. But
and we should add, on the influence side of things, he's of course famously married to Huma Abedin, who is one of Hillary Clinton's closest longtime aides.
One of Hillary Clinton's closest longtime aides, and Chekhov's gun. It was emails in the investigation into his sexting habit that led to them being reopened late in the 2016 election amid great controversy with possibly great implications.
Yes.
So
the healthcare workers union, though, was really the vehicle by which de Blasio rode to victory that first time.
The healthcare workers union and the cable company workers unions. It was 1199 SEIU and the local of the Communications Workers of America. Communications Workers of America is probably the most left-wing private sector labor union. Its former president, a guy by the name of Larry Cohen, is associated with Bernie Sanders's sort of zombie presidential campaign, Our Revolution. The CWA, as a national union, endorsed Sanders for the Democratic nomination in 2016. and it associates with some very far left, even by labor union standards. And then 1199 SEIU is obviously part of the Service Employees International Union, one of the biggest unions in the country. And on the national level, the SEIU is the largest organizational political spender, and we'll get to that later on in this broadcast. But 1199 has a lot of power in New York, the entire, statewide and in the city. And so when 1199, later supported by the CWA, backs de Blasio in 2013, that's when his campaign starts to get a bit of traction and starts to advance.
And they did so precisely because this was an alliance of the far left against the center by Democratic standards.
Right. The CWA launched a massive attack campaign against Quinn, which started to hurt her numbers. She eventually falls below Thompson and comes, I believe, third ultimately. Thompson came second in the 2013 Democrat primary.
Some of our listeners may find it a little shocking that people thought that New York City was very far to the right compared to where it needs to be.
Under Mike Bloomberg, the arch gun controller, the
soda
limiter, the soda ban guy. No, but if you're a particular kind of Democrat, if we can say that on the left they're kind of two broad factions. Obviously, they're subdivided into a bunch of other factions, and all my Democrat friends will be like, no, you've misdescribed it. There are actually 37 factions. Two broad factions. One are socially liberal, economically cautious in their leftism, but aggressively socially liberal. They like Mike Bloomberg a lot because he isn't going to fundamentally reorient the economic underpinnings of the market system, even though he is going to raise their taxes, even though he's going to be more pro-regulation than, say, a generic Republican. And then you have the labor populists. And the labor populists, the Communications Workers Union, the SEIU, those are de Blasio's people. That's where the energy for his campaign came.
Now, there's another organization, Influencer, well worth discussing on this score, and though it's related to our union friends, and that would be the working families.
You say related. I would say heavily funded by and a stalking vehicle for the agenda of.
There you go.
The Working Families Party is... So New York has a weird voting system. In most states, in Washington, D.C., where I vote, all the candidates are there. Everybody has one line. You fill in a bubble. That's how many vote, and then you tally up the votes. In New York State, there are lots of lines, and some of them have the same names. So the Conservative Party of New York tends to endorse Republicans, although it doesn't always. So if you vote for, to use the 2016 presidential election as an example, if you voted for Donald Trump on the Republican line, he doesn't get just those votes. He also gets the votes for Donald Trump on the conservative line. Likewise, if you voted for Hillary Clinton, you could vote on the Democratic line. You could vote on the Working Families line. And those would be summed together with any of the other lines that she was on and would be totaled up together. And then the winner would be determined by the sum total of these lines. It's called fusion voting. The left in the 1990s was really big on fusion voting. They really wanted this because they saw it as a way to push the Bill Clinton era Democrats who had gone kind of over towards this gentry liberal faction where they would combine the social liberalism of 1990, which is the social conservatism of today, with centrist economics, pro NAFTA, not eager to raise taxes as much as as a Mike Dukakis might have been. They hoped to use this fusion voting as a lever to push the Democrats further to the left, and they formed. This is where you get the new party, which was involved in helping launch the career of future President Barack Obama. They sued, went to the Supreme Court to try to get fusion voting instituted nationwide. The Supreme Court says no, new party breaks up. But the guys who were behind the new party brought the idea to New York because New York had fusion voting. And they found the Working Families Party with support from the labor unions.
Yes. So the Working Families Party was another institution that was important for de Blasio's rise. And I should put in a quick plug for our InfluenceWatch.org website. We have a full write-up on this fascinating but very little known entity. And then there's another institution that also was important for de Blasio's rise, and also is featured on InfluenceWatch.org for listeners who want to learn more, and that would be Berlin Rosen. Tell us about them.
So Berlin Rosen are the communications consultants. They're a for-profit company. Every politician has a number of consultants supporting them, a number of political professionals who do things like develop your message, do buy media. They carry out sort of the technical behind the scenes stuff of politics. If you're watching if you're watching CNN or MSNBC or Fox News and somebody comes on and is, ex-Republican strategist or ex-Democratic strategist, at some point in the past, they were one of these consultants, either a general consultant or a communications consultant. That's probably where they got, how they got that title of strategist.
Yep. Now, once these groups had all helped de Blasio to get the Democratic nomination for mayor, he had after all those battles were over, he had a relatively easy time in the general election, facing only token opposition, but he didn't have the simplest of first terms, did he?
No, because he got really chummy with his consultants. Jonathan Rosen, who is the Rosen in Berlin Rosen, was one of his closest aides. When there were questions about financing and campaign finance shenanigans, and he was running a nonprofit out of City Hall, the Campaign for One New York, and the general communications consultants were Berlin Rosen. The questions about whether that was entirely above board eventually got investigated by the New York City District Attorney, by the Campaign Finance Board, and de Blasio tried unsuccessfully to get his communications with Jonathan Rosen privileged from open records laws as an agent of the city.
Which would be an odd thing for a nonprofit entity.
An odd thing for the consultant to a nonprofit entity, the for-profit consultant to a nonprofit entity. The courts did not look kindly upon that designation, and the emails had to be released.
Yeah, now there also were fights with another New York Democrat, Governor Andrew Cuomo, probably because both Cuomo and de Blasio realized that one of them was going to end up king of the hill for the Empire State. Can you tell us a bit about that?
So New York City mayors and New York state governors, even if they're of the same party, as they were for much of the 90s when it was Rudy Giuliani and George Pataki, obviously now with de Blasio and Cuomo, they are known to fight. The governor controls the city transit authority. The governor and the mayor, again, both trying to be king of the hill. With Cuomo and de Blasio, there was also a bit of an ideological struggle. Cuomo is more of that gentry liberal side, gentry liberal and building trades unions, whereas de Blasio is more ideological progressives and left wing of labor. So they were fighting over things like taxes. They were fighting over how to finance a new pre-K entitlement. De Blasio wanted a millionaire's tax. Cuomo did not want that. So Cuomo orchestrated a way to get it through the state legislature without a millionaire's tax.
Yes, and anybody who's looked into the budget of New York State can understand Andrew Cuomo's concerns about that, because the flood of people leaving New York, especially high dollar ones, and heading for tax havens like Florida is significant.
people who live in New York tend to like living in New York, but I don't think they have the same ability as California to ride on their climate to keep the high taxpayers in the state.
Yes,
especially when the alternative is Florida.
If you're a wealthy 70-something who already has a spot in Florida, and you start spending some time with your estate attorneys on just what the state of New York intends to swipe from you at your death, because Florida not only doesn't have income, but doesn't have an estate tax.
Once you figure out that a first class flight from Fort Lauderdale to LaGuardia is cheaper, to go to the shows when you want to go to the shows is cheaper than what the New York State taxman is expecting you to pay up.
Perhaps understandable. Well, so despite all this turmoil in his first term, Mayor de Blasio, by the time 2017 rolls around and it's time for another primary and another general election, he didn't face much opposition. But it is still well worthwhile looking deep into the influencers and support structures that Blasio has in place, because obviously America has not heard the last of Bill de Blasio. Let's go back to the Berlin-Rosen Strategic Communication Consultancy and dig a little deeper there.
So de Blasio isn't the only major client of Berlin-Rosen. The other big one is Eric Schneiderman, who's the Attorney General of New York State. Might run for governor at some point in the future, because that's what all attorney generals really want to do. And has made a big name of himself as as the legal wing of the supposed resistance to the Trump administration. Berlin-Rosen also is a major communication consultant for major labor unions, most notably the Service Employees International Union. You may remember, for a few years from about 2012 to 2016, big, quote unquote, fast food strikes. Supposedly this was the big walkout. This was going to revitalize labor. This was going to get a $15 minimum wage, was going to unionize McDonald's. Yeah, it was mostly concocted at Berlin-Rosen. They were paid millions of dollars by the SEIU to create these strike-in-a-box, campaign strategies. And at one point, one of these quote-unquote strikes, even an AP reporter had to write in a write-up, it wasn't clear how many of the demonstrators were actual workers, fast food workers, or were members of the communications consultancy that was supporting the campaign, which we may read to mean Berlin-Rosen.
Yes, it's a great irony in a way that seems to happen somewhat frequently on the left, that the constituencies they claim to be speaking for are not actually there.
The level of orchestration that sometimes has to go into some of these campaigns. Now, not all the time. I think, even though there was institutional support for something like the Women's March, I think that was more like the Tea Party, where there was institutional support for the Tea Party, but that was mostly an organized, I don't like the president.
Yes, actually in both those cases, it was a genuine groundswell.
Yeah, a genuine groundswell of supporters of the party that is in the opposition and doesn't like what the president is doing. In the case of some of these other things, why does everyone all of a sudden care about net neutrality? Why does everyone all of a sudden want a $15 minimum wage? Then you're getting into organized influence campaigns, some of which involve this, what you might call astroturfing. Supposedly there are grassroots. I've been in Washington long enough to be skeptical that grassroots exist. But actually what you're seeing is a campaign being laid out by professional organizers backed by an established interest.
Yep. Now, I won't go too far afield on this, because it probably should be an entire separate show, but you mentioned that Berlin-Rosen has also worked for the New York State Attorney General, Eric Schneiderman. Schneiderman, we should note, was one of the leading state attorneys general of the 17 who have tried to go after ExxonMobil in the kind of shakedown of that was done previous decades against the tobacco industry. Because obviously ExxonMobil has deep pockets too, and those state attorneys general are mixed up in a little cabal of environmental groups that are slowly, thanks to some of our friends at Judicial Watch, having their emails uncovered to show the kind of working together relationships that some of these state attorneys generals and governors have had with a lot of environmental groups.
Funny you should bring up Greens and for whom Berlin-Rosen has consulted, because Schneiderman's not the only one. In 2016, after the general election, you might remember the Green Party's candidate, Jill Stein, doing these quote-unquote recounts. Her communications consultants during those recounts were Berlin-Rosen.
Aha. Well, you also mentioned the Coalition for One New York.
Campaign for One New York.
Sorry, Campaign for One New York. Tell us a bit more about that.
So in New York City, and this goes back, I think, at least to the Bloomberg administration, there's the City Hall has had these, in-house essentially in-house nonprofits that promote the mayor's agenda, lobbying and by lobbying and advocacy. A lot of good government groups see them as slush funds. That if you have business, it is probably not out of the goodness of the hearts of the American Federation of Teachers, which is the parent of the United Federation of Teachers, the main teachers union in New York City, gave six-figure contributions to the Campaign for One New York while the UFT was negotiating a new contract. You can see where the appearance of impropriety may be warranted, and part of what de Blasio did with the campaign in the first term, it was the Campaign for One New York, was he used it to reward his friends, and he gave Berlin-Rosen a $500,000 retainer to be the communications consultants for Campaign for One New York. He was also running so New York state politics are fascinating. And perhaps the weirdest part of them is that instead of the normal two-party system in their legislature, in the state Senate, they have a 3.5-party system. You have Republicans, who are normal Northeastern Republicans, too close to the labor unions for comfort, a bit big government-y, but mostly Republican. You have the Democrats, who are normal Northeastern Democrats, really liberal. And then you have the Independent Democratic Conference, who are breakaway Democrats, who have no ideology discernible independent of Democrats other than they want to be important, and they coalition with the Republicans to give the Republicans effective control of the state Senate. And then the half a party is one senator from Brooklyn who is a Democrat but sits in the Republican caucus room. This, needless to say, annoys Bill de Blasio, who wants the Democratic Party, which is more New York City-based. The Republican Party of New York is mostly especially in the state Senate, is upstate-based in the rural and small towns north of Westchester County. De Blasio wants power unified in New York City. So he, in 2014, ran these campaigns to oust Independent Democratic Conference and Republican members from the state Senate. And the way he did it got him an investigation from the state and city campaign finance authorities. Because what they were doing was de Blasio's people would allegedly tell big liberal megadonors that they should support county Democratic parties upstate who are supporting candidates who are aligned with de Blasio and the mainline Democrats. And then the local Democratic parties would route their funds to consultants aligned with de Blasio, including Berlin-Rosen. And then the megadonors would also give money to the Campaign for One New York. Now, what you're not allowed to do under campaign finance law, if you're a 501c4 like Campaign for One New York, is talk to local political parties and candidates' campaigns. That's a no-no. That's what the Supreme Court said differentiated an independent expenditure. I believe in left-wing New York City liberalism, so I'm going to support candidates who support that, independent of their campaigns, and then a campaign contribution, an in-kind campaign contribution. I'm a left-wing liberal, and I like left-wing liberal candidates, so I'm going to give services in lieu of money to some candidate in Utica.
Now, we should say here, of course, that these kind of campaign finance laws with which Berlin Rosen and de Blasio have had unhappy encounters, those laws were all created by the left-wing movement for campaign finance reform, which exists to hamstring the parties and then has the practical effect of causing the production of these kind of outside groups, because if the political party has big limits on what it can raise and spend,
you can't give as much money as you would like to the Monroe County Democratic Party. So to get your candidate elected in Rochester, you have to route it through these weirdnesses. And yeah, it was mostly the quote unquote good government left that thought, oh, this is how we will get corruption out.
Yeah. Or as they say in New York, sneeringly about the so-called good government types, the goo-goos. Precisely because, of course, the goo-goos claiming that they're going to clean up politics only make it even more Byzantine, more dark, and probably more corrupt.
I mean, it's, to a brief aside on corruption in New York State, although I think all the convictions are going to be thrown out under the McDonnell rule, the Supreme Court decision that made it much harder to prove a bribery charge involving former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell. At one point, the Speaker of the State Senate, or the President of the State Senate, the Speaker of the State House of Representatives had both been convicted of corruption, and the Governor of New York State and the Mayor of New York City were under investigation but never charged.
Yes. They could give Illinois a run for their money. Well, let's switch now from Berlin Rosen to the Working Families Party that you mentioned earlier. We've already explained how minor parties become important in New York because you can get multiple endorsements. If you're Hillary Clinton running, you don't just want to have that Democratic Party line.
You don't get just the Democratic line. You get the Democratic line. You get the Working Families line. There's an Independence Party, which usually endorses whoever's going to win. And then, on the right wing side, you have the Conservative Party, and those are kind of the five that. There's also the Women's Equality Party, which is just in the pocket of of Cuomo.
Yep. Now you mentioned how Working Families Party has a heavy ties to labor unions, gets lots of its money from the labor unions, but there are other left-wing groups that also have connections to Working Families Party.
So you may remember the old Acorn community organizing enterprise that broke up amid many allegations of many campaign finance and other shenanigans,
vote fraud, and
in the kind of late 2000s. It was closely aligned with the SEIU and some of these other left-wing labor unions, and its people, and the people who work for the SEIU in New York were integral in creating the Working Families Party.
Yep, and we should add, anytime we bring up Acorn, that is something that both InfluenceWatch.org and our parent think tank, the Capital Research Center, so capitalresearch.org, has a great deal to contribute on the research of that. And of course, our Vice President Matthew Vadum is the author of an entire book on the Acorn Network, which we should probably devote a show to, because while the network officially went bankrupt in 2010, there are still many of its state chapters.
The labor unions that provided the financial support basically opened with many of the same activist leaders, many of the same, in some cases, the same address, offices under names.
Yeah, exactly. So there's still a good bit of the network left. Well, the third entity that we've mentioned is critical in the de Blasio machine is the Local 1199 of SEIU, also known as the Union That Rules New York.
And to give some credit for that Union That Rules New York tag, that comes from Daniel DeSalvo of the Manhattan Institute, a center-right think tank based in Manhattan. So it's the New York City-based healthcare unit of the Service Employees International Union, which is one of the biggest and most politically involved unions in the United States. Its 1199 is probably more politically savvy than its parent, although it's been led by very ideologically left-wing leadership. It knows when to play footsie with the state Republicans. In the 1990s, the Republicans held the governorship and held a majority in the state Senate. So the 1199 made nice with the governor and with state Senate Republicans in order to get benefits, more jobs, expansions of Medicaid. And again, this is pure marriage of pure now divorced marriage of convenience. And 1199 claims to have 100,000 registered Democrats in New York City, which gives them a massive ability to shift a city Democratic primary, which they showed in 2013 when they backed de Blasio and kind of pushed him towards and ultimately over the line.
Yeah. And as we said at the beginning, all of this should matter to not just New York City residents, not just New York State residents, but arguably everybody in the country, because the New York City mayor is in many ways more like a state governor than simply a city mayor.
8 million people live in New York City. If New York City were a state, I believe it would be in the top 15 by population. 8 million is roughly the size of the state of Virginia. Yes. It's a massive position. Again, Rudy Giuliani, although he was unsuccessful, used his perch as mayor to launch a run for president. Every 4 years, people ask, is Michael Bloomberg going to run for president?
Partly because he could self-finance.
Partly because Bloomberg has the money to self-finance.
And we should add that's another thing that we should credit our left-wing friends in campaign finance reform for. One of the things that the Supreme Court has never gone along with is the idea that you could stop me from contributing to my own political campaign. And therefore, since campaign finance reform got, quote-unquote, work to get money out of politics, in fact, you have billionaires more prominent.
Ever since another prominent New Yorker, then Senator, now federal Judge James Buckley, won a Supreme Court case back in the 70s it has been the position of the Supreme Court that any money you give to your own campaign is your own free speech, so you can spend whatever you like.
So let's credit the campaign finance folks in part for the Trump victory, since he is another self-financing billionaire. I'm sure they'll be proud of that.
Again, this now makes 2 weeks where we've caught where the left has butterfly affected themselves into a position that they probably don't want to be.
That's right. Well, speaking of de Blasio's ambitions on the national stage, one of the points adduced in evidence of those would be a 501c4 that he formed. Tell us about that.
So in 2015, as the Democratic primaries for the 2016 election and kind of the debates about what sort of position the Democratic Party was going to take going forward were being announced, de Blasio comes out with this progressive agenda, a laundry list of left-wing things that he wanted, like a new paid leave entitlement, a new, $15 minimum wage, make it easier to unionize, the usual. Yeah. And he had also, it turned out, formed a 501c4 organization, an advocacy group, which he called the Progressive Agenda Committee, to promote his progressive agenda and, one suspects, his own personal profile. He hasn't done much with it recently. The only year for which tax records are available, it spent like $430,000. But you don't set up an organization like that to raise your national profile unless you want a national profile.
Yes, and of course we're a ways away from the next presidential cycle when it might come in more handy for him. Well, the Working Families Party brand is also apparently thinking about going national. And of course, that would mean a big thing.
Not just thinking about they are. Mostly the liberal states. They're other than New York, their big states are Connecticut and Oregon, which are both pretty strongly Democratic. But yeah, they are looking to expand out of New York, not just in states that have fusion voting, because they're trying to bring the quote unquote working families brand. They have in addition to the party, they have a 501c4, the Working Families Organization, which played heavily in the recent elections in New Jersey. What should be kind of concerning about for people interested in the influence being employed here is that people haven't really heard about working families, about where it came from, about what its ideology is, and what its alignment with some very far left interests are. That according to a campaign proposal memo, which was acquired by the Washington Free Beacon back before the 2016 elections, was that polling that was conducted by the Working Families Organization, the 501c4 of the party, and the Center for Popular Democracy Action Fund, which is a left-wing organizing and political advocacy group, which we will absolutely at some point cover, found that the Working Families Party, the Working Families Organization, was, quote, a credible messenger and moderate voice rather than one on the far left, close quote, in the eyes of voters.
Which just happens to be the exact opposite
Which happens to be the exact opposite of the actual truth.
Yes.
Again, we can surmise this is because they have absolutely no name recognition outside the city of New York.
Yes, and the unions, of course, working families is a trope that the unions have used for decades.
A long time union slogan.
Yep. Well, the local SEIU that de Blasio has been involved with, the 1199, that too, along with its parent organization, will almost certainly have a significant national effect in the coming cycles.
When you think about the involvement of quote unquote big labor in politics, SEIU is the biggest part of big labor when it comes to politics. According to the Center for Responsive Politics,
which is a left-wing organization,
which is a left of center organization, of organizational contributors and of identifiable employers of major single issue mega donors, 6 out of the top 10 through the 2016 cycle are labor unions, and the SEIU is still the largest, even in the age of Tom Steyer, of Sheldon Adelson, of the Mercers and
the Kochs,
Mercer's business partner, who's a liberal, former business partner who's a liberal. Even in the age of them, of these billionaire mega donors, the SEIU is still the largest organizational contributor.
Yes, not something that frequently appears in the news reports on campaigns in our major media, sadly.
No, because the SEIU gives 99.5+% of its contributions to the left and to Democrats.
Yes. So, before I wrap up our show this week, I just want to urge everybody who's listening or watching, you can find much, much more on all of the groups that we've talked about, the SEIU 1199, the Working Families Parties, the Berlin Rosen Communications Firm, by going to InfluenceWatch.org. That's our show for this week. If you're listening to this on iTunes or Stitcher, know that we broadcast a live video version of this podcast at 10 a.m. on Thursdays on Facebook Live and YouTube, and you can find our pages by searching for Capital Research Center. If you're watching the video version, we encourage you to subscribe to the audio version on your preferred podcast platform. We'll see you next week.